Number 1. Dylann Roof, the Charleston Church Massacre. On the evening of June 17, 2015, 21-year-old Dylann Roof walked into the historic Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, carrying a concealed Glock 41 semi-automatic pistol and 8 magazines loaded with hollow-point bullets. The church, known affectionately as Mother Emanuel, stood as one of the oldest black churches in the United States, founded in 1816 and steeped in a rich history of civil rights activism and community leadership. That Wednesday evening, 12 parishioners had gathered in the fellowship hall for their weekly Bible study session, a sacred tradition that brought together congregants of all ages to discuss Scripture, share their faith, and strengthen their bonds as a community. Roof, a white supremacist who had spent months immersing himself in racist ideology online and planning a massacre designed to ignite a race war, arrived at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening and was welcomed without hesitation by the Bible study participants. The church had a long-standing tradition of openness, never turning away anyone who sought spiritual guidance or wished to participate in worship, and the parishioners embodied this ethos of radical hospitality, even when confronted by a stranger whose disheveled appearance and quiet demeanor might have raised concerns elsewhere. For nearly an hour, Roof sat among the Bible study participants, listening as Reverend Clementa Pinckney, a 41-year-old state senator and the church's senior pastor, led the group through a discussion of the parable of the sower from the Gospel of Mark. The congregants later recalled that Roof sat mostly silent, occasionally looking at his phone, but nothing about his behavior suggested the horror he was about to unleash. As the study session drew to a close and the participants stood to recite their final prayers, their eyes closed and heads bowed in reverence, Roof pulled out his weapon and began firing. He methodically shot each person in the room, reloading his weapon 5 times during the rampage that lasted approximately 6 minutes but would forever alter the fabric of Charleston and reverberate throughout the entire nation. The victims included Reverend Pinckney, whose leadership had touched thousands of lives; Cynthia Hurd, a 64-year-old regional library manager known for her dedication to literacy and education; Susie Jackson, an 87-year-old grandmother and lifelong church member; Ethel Lance, a 70-year-old sexton who had worked at the church for 3 decades; Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor, a 49-year-old minister and admissions coordinator who sang in the choir; Tawanza Sanders, a 26-year-old recent college graduate and aspiring entrepreneur; Reverend Daniel Simmons, a 74-year-old retired pastor; Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, a 45-year-old pastor and high school track coach; and Myra Thompson, a 59-year-old minister who had recently been installed as a vicar. 3 survivors emerged from the massacre, including Polly Shepard, whom Roof deliberately spared, telling her he was leaving her alive to tell others what had happened. During the shooting, witnesses reported that Roof made explicitly racist statements, telling his victims that black people were raping white women and taking over the country, revealing the ideological hatred that had motivated his attack. The investigation that followed moved with remarkable speed, beginning within minutes of the shooting, when Charleston police arrived at the scene to find a horrific tableau of death and suffering. Survivors provided detailed descriptions of the shooter, including his distinctive bowl-cut hairstyle, his clothing, and the black Hyundai sedan he drove away in after the massacre. Law enforcement agencies immediately launched a massive manhunt, disseminating Roof's photograph and vehicle description to police departments throughout the Southeast. Security camera footage from the church and surrounding businesses provided crucial evidence, capturing Roof's arrival and departure and confirming the timeline of events. Less than 14 hours after the shooting, at approximately 10:44 on the morning of June 18th, Roof was apprehended during a traffic stop in Shelby, North Carolina, approximately 250 miles north of Charleston. The arresting officer, who had been alerted to be on the lookout for Roof's vehicle, spotted the black Hyundai and conducted a traffic stop that ended without incident, with Roof surrendering peacefully and offering no resistance. A search of his vehicle revealed the murder weapon, ammunition, and additional evidence linking him to the crime. During his initial interrogation, Roof waived his Miranda rights and confessed to the shootings, providing a detailed account of his planning and execution of the attack. He told investigators that he had chosen Emmanuel AME Church specifically because of its historical significance in the Black community and had hoped his actions would start a race war. The federal investigation uncovered extensive evidence of Roof's radicalization, including a manifesto he had posted online in which he expressed admiration for white supremacist movements, apartheid-era South Africa, and racist regimes throughout history. Investigators discovered that Roof had created a website containing photographs of himself posing with Confederate flags, white supremacist symbols, and the murder weapon, along with racist screeds in which he outlined his ideology and his intention to commit violence. The investigation also revealed troubling gaps in the background check system that had allowed Roof to purchase the Glock pistol used in the massacre despite a previous arrest for drug possession that should have prohibited him from buying firearms. This revelation sparked intense debate about gun control and background check procedures, with many arguing that systemic failures had enabled the attack. Roof faced both state and federal charges, with prosecutors in both jurisdictions seeking the death penalty for what they characterized as one of the most heinous hate crimes in modern American history. The federal case proceeded first, with Roof charged with 33 counts including hate crimes, obstruction of the exercise of religion, and firearms violations. The trial began in November 2016 in Charleston, with Roof representing himself during the penalty phase after dismissing his court-appointed attorneys. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Roof's guilt, including his confession, surveillance footage, ballistic evidence, and testimony from survivors who had witnessed the massacre. The defense offered no substantive rebuttal, with Roof's attorneys having attempted unsuccessfully to argue that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. Roof himself showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, maintaining his racist beliefs and stating that he felt he had to commit the murders to defend the white race. The trial was marked by extraordinary moments of grace and forgiveness, most notably during the bond hearing just 2 days after the shooting when family members of the victims addressed Roof directly, with several offering forgiveness even as they grappled with their unbearable grief. These statements of forgiveness, while deeply moving to observers worldwide, also sparked important conversations about the expectations placed on Black victims of violence to show grace toward their oppressors and whether such forgiveness should be expected or even encouraged given the magnitude of the crime and its racist motivation. On December 15, 2016, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding Roof guilty on all 33 federal counts. The penalty phase of the trial began immediately, with prosecutors presenting evidence of the devastating impact the murders had on the victims' families and the broader Charleston community. Survivors testified about the trauma they continued to experience, describing nightmares, anxiety, and the struggle to return to normal life after witnessing such unspeakable violence. Family members spoke of their loss, painting intimate portraits of the 9 individuals whose lives had been stolen, emphasizing not just their deaths but the vibrant, meaningful lives they had lived and the holes their absence had created in families and communities. Mental health experts testified about Roof's psychological state, with the prosecution arguing that while he may have held delusional beliefs about race, he was fully competent and aware of his actions, while the defense attempted to present evidence of mental illness and autism spectrum disorder that they argued should be considered as mitigating factors. Roof, representing himself, offered no defense and called no witnesses, making brief statements that reiterated his racist ideology without expressing any regret for his actions. On January 10, 2017, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty on all 18 counts eligible for capital punishment, making Roof the first person to receive a federal death sentence for hate crimes. The judge formally imposed the sentence, along with life imprisonment on the remaining counts, ensuring that Roof would never be released even if his death sentence were somehow overturned. The state murder case remained pending but was essentially placed on hold given the federal death sentence, though prosecutors maintained the option to proceed if the federal conviction were ever reversed. Roof is currently housed on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he remains in solitary confinement awaiting the exhaustion of his appeals. The Charleston church massacre had profound and far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the criminal justice proceedings against Roof. The attack sparked a national reckoning with symbols of the Confederacy and white supremacy, leading to the removal of the Confederate flag from the South Carolina State House grounds just weeks after the shooting, ending a display that had persisted for decades despite protests from civil rights activists. The massacre also intensified debates about domestic terrorism, hate crimes, and the rise of white supremacist ideology in America, with law enforcement agencies and researchers documenting an alarming increase in such extremism facilitated in part by online radicalization. Emmanuel AME Church, though forever scarred by the violence it experienced, reopened for worship just days after the shooting, with thousands attending services in a powerful demonstration of resilience and faith. The church has since become a symbol of both tragedy and hope, a place where visitors come to pay their respects and to reflect on the ongoing struggle against racism and hatred. The victims of the Charleston massacre are remembered not as passive targets, but as martyrs who died while engaged in the sacred work of studying Scripture and building community. Their legacy inspiring continued efforts toward racial justice and reconciliation, even as their loss remains an open wound that time cannot fully heal. Number 2. Brock Turner, the Stanford sexual assault case. On January 18, 2015, in the early morning hours following a fraternity party at Stanford University, 2 graduate students riding bicycles across campus encountered a scene that would lead to one of the most controversial and widely publicized sexual assault cases in American history. The 2 students, Peter Johnson and Carl Frederick Arndt, noticed a young man on top of an apparently unconscious woman behind a dumpster near the Kappa Alpha fraternity house. When they approached to investigate, the man, later identified as 19-year-old Stanford freshman and varsity swimmer Brock Allen Turner, attempted to flee the scene. The graduate students chased Turner, tackled him, and held him until Stanford police arrived minutes later. The victim, a 22-year-old woman who would become known to the public as Emily Doe before later revealing her identity as Chanel Miller, was found partially clothed and unresponsive, with pine needles in her hair and abrasions on her body. She had no memory of the assault itself, having consumed alcohol earlier in the evening that left her in a state of severe intoxication and unconsciousness. The investigation began immediately, with Stanford Department of Public Safety officers securing the scene and calling for backup from the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office. Turner was detained at the scene and initially claimed that the encounter had been consensual, though he struggled to provide a coherent account of what had occurred. The victim was transported to Santa Clara Valley Medical Center, where she underwent a sexual assault forensic examination that would later provide crucial evidence. During this examination, which she would later describe as a deeply traumatic experience in itself, nurses collected evidence including photographs of injuries, DNA samples, and physical evidence that would be analyzed in the investigation. When the victim regained consciousness at the hospital, she had no memory of the assault or how she had ended up there. Learning the details of what had happened to her through conversations with police and hospital staff, the realization that she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious, unable to consent or defend herself, initiated a trauma that would persist long after her physical injuries healed. The investigation uncovered extensive evidence supporting the accounts of the graduate students who had interrupted the assault. Johnson and Arndt provided detailed statements describing exactly what they had witnessed, including Turner's position on top of the victim, his movements suggesting sexual activity, and the victim's complete lack of responsiveness. They described how Turner had attempted to run when they approached, raising immediate questions about his claims of consensual activity. Physical evidence collected from the scene, including the victim's clothing and biological samples, corroborated the witnesses' accounts. Turner's own statements to police contained inconsistencies and evolved over time as he was confronted with evidence that contradicted his initial claims. Cell phone records and testimony from other party attendees helped establish a timeline of events and the victim's level of intoxication throughout the evening. Witnesses who had seen the victim at the party described her as extremely intoxicated, stumbling, and at times incoherent, raising serious questions about her capacity to consent to any sexual activity. Turner himself admitted to investigators that he had been drinking but claimed he was coherent enough to recognize that the encounter was consensual, despite acknowledging that the victim was intoxicated and that they had only just met that evening. The case proceeded to trial with Turner facing 5 felony charges including rape of an intoxicated person, rape of an unconscious person, sexual penetration of an intoxicated person, sexual penetration of an unconscious person, and assault with intent to commit rape. Turner rejected a plea deal and maintained his innocence, with his defense team arguing that any sexual contact had been consensual and that the victim had been conscious and responsive during their encounter. The trial, which began in March 2016, became a flashpoint for national discussions about sexual assault, consent, campus rape culture, and the treatment of sexual assault victims within the criminal justice system. The prosecution presented a compelling case built on eyewitness testimony, forensic evidence, and expert testimony about intoxication and the ability to consent. Johnson and Arndt testified about what they had witnessed, their accounts remaining consistent and credible under cross-examination. Medical experts testified about the victim's level of intoxication, explaining that her blood alcohol content, measured hours after the assault at more than twice the legal limit for driving, would have been significantly higher at the time of the assault and would have rendered her incapable of consenting to sexual activity. Forensic evidence, including DNA found on the victim's body and physical injuries consistent with sexual assault, supported the prosecution's narrative. The victim herself provided testimony that, while she could not remember the assault, detailed the devastating impact it had on her life and confronted the defense's attempts to blame her for her intoxication and suggest that she bore responsibility for what happened to her. The defense strategy relied heavily on attacking the victim's credibility and suggesting that her intoxication and memory loss meant she could not definitively say the encounter was non-consensual. Turner's attorneys presented character witnesses who described him as a dedicated student and athlete with no history of violence or sexual misconduct, attempting to portray the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding between 2 intoxicated college students rather than a predatory assault. Turner testified in his own defense, claiming that the victim had been responsive and that they had mutually engaged in sexual activity before he stepped away to urinate, at which point the graduate students had approached. His testimony contradicted physical evidence and eyewitness accounts in significant ways, and prosecutors effectively challenged his credibility through cross-examination. The defense also introduced evidence about the victim's alcohol consumption and suggested that she had voluntarily consumed enough alcohol to black out, implying that this somehow mitigated Turner's culpability for assaulting her while she was in that vulnerable state. This victim-blaming strategy, while not uncommon in sexual assault trials, sparked outrage among advocates who argued that it perpetuated harmful myths about sexual assault and placed responsibility on victims rather than perpetrators. On March 30, 2016, after deliberating for several days, the jury found Turner guilty on 3 felony counts: assault with intent to commit rape of an intoxicated woman, sexually penetrating an intoxicated person with a foreign object, and sexually penetrating an unconscious person with a foreign object. He was acquitted on 2 additional charges related to rape, as the prosecution had not proven digital penetration beyond a reasonable doubt. The conviction carried a potential sentence of up to 14 years in state prison, and prosecutors recommended 6 years, arguing that Turner had shown no remorse and had put the victim through the additional trauma of a trial rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. However, the sentencing hearing on June 2, 2016, would become perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire case. Judge Aaron Persky, citing Turner's youth, lack of criminal history, and the impact that a lengthy prison sentence would have on his future, sentenced him to just 6 months in county jail followed by 3 years of probation, a sentence that was widely perceived as shockingly lenient given the severity of the crimes and the devastating impact on the victim. Judge Persky stated that he believed Turner would not be a danger to others and that a longer sentence would have a severe impact on him, comments that many interpreted as prioritizing the perpetrator's well-being over the victim's suffering and the broader message such leniency sent about the seriousness of sexual assault. The sentencing decision sparked immediate and intense public outrage, particularly after the victim's impact statement was published and went viral, reaching millions of people worldwide. In her statement, which would later be read on the floor of Congress and published as part of her memoir, the victim powerfully articulated the trauma of being sexually assaulted, the additional violation of having her character attacked during the trial, and her anger at a system that seemed more concerned with protecting her assailant's future than with delivering justice for the harm he had caused. She described the devastating impact the assault and trial had on every aspect of her life, from her mental health to her relationships to her sense of safety and autonomy in the world. The statement resonated deeply with sexual assault survivors and advocates who saw in her words a reflection of their own experiences with a criminal justice system that too often fails to hold perpetrators accountable. The public backlash against the sentence led to a recall campaign against Judge Persky, who became the first California judge to be recalled in more than 80 years when voters removed him from office in June 2018. Turner's father also drew widespread criticism for a letter he submitted to the court asking for leniency, in which he characterized his son's crime as 20 minutes of action that shouldn't define his life, a statement that many found deeply offensive and indicative of the privilege and minimization that often protect perpetrators of sexual violence. Turner ultimately served only 3 months of his 6-month sentence before being released on September 2, 2016, due to good behavior credits, a release that further intensified criticism of the case's outcome. Following his release, Turner returned to his family home in Ohio, where he was required to register as a sex offender for life, a consequence that would restrict his residence, employment, and movement for the rest of his life. His appeals of the conviction were denied, with appellate courts finding that the jury had been properly instructed and that the evidence overwhelmingly supported the guilty verdict. The Stanford sexual assault case had far-reaching impacts that extended well beyond Turner's conviction and minimal incarceration. The case became a cultural touchstone in conversations about sexual assault, consent, and rape culture, particularly on college campuses where similar assaults occur with disturbing frequency but often go unreported or unprosecuted. The victim's decision to come forward, despite the tremendous personal cost and trauma involved, inspired other survivors to share their stories and seek justice. California lawmakers responded to the case by passing legislation that mandated minimum prison sentences for sexual assault crimes similar to those Turner committed, closing the loophole that had allowed Judge Persky to impose such a lenient sentence. The case also contributed to broader movements like Me Too, which gained momentum in subsequent years as survivors of sexual assault and harassment began speaking out en masse about their experiences and demanding accountability. Universities across the country re-examined their policies for handling sexual assault allegations and their responsibilities to protect students and ensure that campus environments don't enable predatory behavior. The Stanford case highlighted the ways that privilege, particularly white privilege and the privilege associated with elite educational institutions and athletic achievement, can shield perpetrators from full accountability for their actions. Turner's status as a Stanford student and promising swimmer was repeatedly cited as a reason for leniency, sending a troubling message that such achievements could mitigate or excuse sexual violence. The case also underscored the importance of bystander intervention, with the graduate students who stopped the assault and held Turner accountable being rightfully celebrated as heroes whose actions ensured that the assault didn't go undetected and that the victim received medical attention and the opportunity for justice. In 2019, the victim revealed her identity as Chanel Miller and published a memoir titled Know My Name, in which she recounted her experience in detail and reclaimed her narrative from those who had tried to define her by what had been done to her. Her book and subsequent advocacy work have continued to raise awareness about sexual assault and the need for systemic change in how such crimes are investigated, prosecuted, and discussed in public discourse. The Stanford sexual assault case remains one of the most significant criminal cases of the decade, not because of the severity of the sentence imposed, but because of the conversations it sparked and the changes it catalyzed in law, policy, and public consciousness regarding sexual violence and accountability. Number 3. Omar Mateen, the Pulse nightclub massacre. In the early morning hours of June 12, 2016, 29-year-old Omar Mateen entered Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and opened fire on the approximately 300 patrons who had gathered for Latin Night, killing 49 people and wounding 53 others in what became the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time and the deadliest terrorist attack on U.S. soil since September 11, 2001. The attack began at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, shortly before the club's scheduled closing time, when Mateen, armed with the SIG Sauer MCX semi-automatic rifle and a Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol, both legally purchased just days before the massacre, entered through the main entrance and immediately began shooting into the crowded dance floor. The initial burst of gunfire lasted several minutes, with Mateen methodically targeting victims as they attempted to flee or find cover in the packed nightclub. Survivors later described scenes of absolute chaos and terror, with bodies falling around them, screams of panic and pain filling the air, and the desperate scramble to escape or hide as Mateen continued his rampage. Off-duty Orlando police officer Adam Gruler, who was working security at the club, immediately engaged Mateen in a gunfight, likely preventing even more casualties by forcing the shooter to take cover and interrupting his initial assault. Within minutes, additional Orlando police officers arrived and exchanged gunfire with Mateen, who retreated into a bathroom area of the club, taking several hostages and barricading himself inside. What followed was a 3-hour standoff during which Mateen made multiple calls to 911, claiming allegiance to ISIS and its leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, while also referencing other terrorist organizations including Hezbollah and al-Qaeda, groups with conflicting ideologies that suggested his claims of ideological motivation may have been opportunistic or confused rather than representing genuine commitment to any particular cause. During these calls, Mateen demanded that the United States stop bombing Syria and Iraq, though he provided little coherent political or religious justification for his attack beyond these vague references to foreign policy and Islamic extremism. Police negotiators attempted to establish communication with Mateen and convince him to surrender, while SWAT teams positioned themselves around the building and began evacuating injured victims and people who had managed to hide in other parts of the club. Inside the bathroom where Mateen had taken hostages, survivors later recounted the terror of those 3 hours, trapped with a mass murderer who had just killed dozens of people and seemed prepared to kill again. Some hostages attempted to text loved ones and emergency services, providing real-time information about their location and Mateen's statements and behavior. The wounded, some critically injured and bleeding, tried to remain silent and still to avoid drawing attention from Mateen, who paced the bathroom and periodically threatened to kill his hostages. At approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, after receiving information that Mateen had explosives and was threatening to detonate them, police made the decision to breach the bathroom wall using an armored vehicle and explosive charges to create an opening through which hostages could escape and officers could engage Mateen. The breach was successful, allowing several hostages to flee to safety, but it also reignited the gunfight between Mateen and law enforcement. officers engaged Mateen in close-quarters combat inside the club, with multiple officers firing at the shooter. Mateen was struck by gunfire multiple times and died at the scene, ending the siege but leaving behind a scene of unimaginable carnage. First responders who entered the club described it as a war zone, with victims scattered throughout the building, some already deceased, others critically wounded and requiring immediate medical attention. The triage and evacuation process was complicated by the scale of the casualties and the need to ensure that the scene was secure and that no other threats existed. Injured victims were transported to Orlando Regional Medical Center and other area hospitals, where trauma teams worked frantically to save lives, performing dozens of emergency surgeries and treating injuries ranging from gunshot wounds to crush injuries sustained as people stampeded to escape. The death toll of 49 made the Pulse nightclub massacre the deadliest mass shooting in modern U.S. history, surpassing the Virginia Tech shooting of 2007, though it would later be exceeded by the Las Vegas shooting in 2017. The victims ranged in age from 18 to 50 and included people of diverse backgrounds, though the majority were Latino and LGBTQ+, reflecting the club's identity as a safe space for the Latino and LGBTQ+ communities in Orlando. The investigation into Mateen's background and motivations began immediately, with the FBI leading a massive effort to understand how and why the attack had occurred and whether Mateen had accomplices or connections to international terrorist organizations. Investigators discovered that Mateen had been on the FBI's radar previously, having been interviewed twice in 2013 and 2014 regarding statements he allegedly made claiming connections to terrorists and expressing sympathy for extremist ideologies. In both cases, the FBI had investigated and closed the cases after finding insufficient evidence that Mateen posed a credible threat or had actual connections to terrorist groups. This revelation sparked intense scrutiny of the FBI's investigative procedures and raised questions about whether warning signs had been missed or dismissed. The investigation revealed a complex and often contradictory picture of Mateen's life and potential motivations. Born in New York to Afghan immigrant parents, Mateen had grown up in Florida and worked as a security guard, a job that had required him to undergo background checks that he passed despite the previous FBI investigations. Co-workers described him as aggressive, unstable, and prone to making inflammatory statements, including racist and homophobic comments, though he had never been formally disciplined or fired for these behaviors. His ex-wife, whom he had been married to briefly in 2009, described him as mentally unstable and physically abusive, painting a picture of a violent and controlling man with serious anger management issues. However, she also stated that she had never heard him express extremist religious views or sympathy for terrorist organizations during their marriage. Friends and acquaintances provided conflicting accounts of Mateen's religiosity, with some describing him as not particularly devout while others noted that he had become more religiously observant in the months before the attack. Several regular Pulse patrons came forward after the shooting to report that they had seen Mateen at the club on multiple occasions prior to the massacre, and some claimed he had used gay dating apps, raising questions about whether internalized homophobia and self-hatred may have been motivating factors alongside or instead of religious extremism. The FBI's investigation examined Mateen's electronic devices, social media accounts, and internet search history, finding evidence that he had researched previous mass shootings and terrorist attacks, including the San Bernardino shooting 6 months earlier, and had viewed ISIS propaganda materials online. However, investigators found no evidence that Mateen had any direct contact with ISIS or had received instructions or support from the organization, leading them to conclude that he was likely a self-radicalized lone wolf rather than part of an organized terrorist cell. His weapons purchases in the days before the attack, which included the rifle and handgun used in the massacre along with thousands of rounds of ammunition, raised questions about gun sale regulations and whether his purchases should have triggered any red flags, particularly given his previous FBI investigations, though he had passed all required background checks because the previous investigations had not resulted in charges or placement on a terrorist watch list. Mateen's widow, Noor Salman, was arrested in January 2017 and charged with aiding and abetting her husband's material support to ISIS and obstruction of justice, with prosecutors alleging that she knew of Mateen's plans and helped him prepare for the attack by accompanying him on surveillance trips to potential targets and failing to warn authorities despite knowing what he intended to do. However, Salman was acquitted of all charges in March 2018 after a trial in which her defense argued that she had been a victim of her husband's abuse and manipulation and had not truly understood his intentions or had the ability to stop him. The trial highlighted the challenges of prosecuting individuals accused of having knowledge of terrorist plots and the difficulty of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that someone had specific intent to facilitate an attack. The Pulse nightclub massacre had profound and lasting impacts on multiple levels, from the immediate devastation experienced by victims, survivors, and their families to broader conversations about terrorism, gun violence, homophobia, and the vulnerability of LGBTQ+ communities to hate-motivated violence. The attack occurred during Pride Month, a time when LGBTQ+ individuals and communities celebrate their identities and the progress made toward equality, making the targeting of a gay nightclub particularly symbolic and painful. For many in the LGBTQ+ community, the massacre represented a stark reminder that despite legal advances like marriage equality, queer people still face violence and hatred, and that spaces created to provide safety and community remain vulnerable to those who wish to do harm. The Latino community also experienced profound grief, as many of the victims were young Latino men and women who had gathered at Pulse to celebrate their heritage and culture on Latin Night. The intersection of homophobia and anti-Latino prejudice in the targeting of this particular event highlighted the multiple forms of marginalization and violence that LGBTQ+ people of color face. Memorials and vigils were held around the world in the days and weeks following the massacre, with thousands gathering to mourn the dead, support survivors, and demonstrate solidarity with the LGBTQ+ and Latino communities. The attack also reignited debates about gun control, with advocates pointing to Mateen's ability to legally purchase military-style weapons despite having been investigated by the FBI as evidence of dangerous gaps in gun sale regulations. The AR-15 style rifle Mateen used, while not fully automatic, allowed him to fire rapidly and reload quickly, contributing to the high casualty count. Proposals to ban assault weapons, expand background checks, and implement measures to prevent individuals on terrorist watch lists from purchasing firearms gained renewed attention but ultimately failed to advance in Congress, reflecting the ongoing political stalemate on gun policy in the United States. The massacre also occurred in the context of increasingly vitriolic political rhetoric about Muslims and terrorism, with some politicians and commentators using the attack to justify anti-Muslim policies and discrimination, while others argued that such rhetoric contributed to the climate of fear and hatred that enables violence. The debate over how to characterize the attack, whether as Islamic terrorism, a hate crime against the LGBTQ+ community, or some combination of both, revealed tensions about how American society understands and responds to violence motivated by ideology, prejudice, or some complex interplay of factors. President Obama visited Orlando in the aftermath of the attack and met with victims' families and survivors, describing the massacre as both an act of terror and an act of hate. The Pulse nightclub itself became a memorial site, with the building purchased by the One Pulse Foundation to create a permanent memorial and museum honoring the victims and educating the public about the attack and its broader significance. Survivors of the massacre have grappled with profound physical and psychological trauma, with many requiring extensive medical treatment for their injuries and ongoing therapy to address PTSD, survivor's guilt, and other mental health challenges. The criminal investigation concluded with Mateen's death, but civil litigation continued as victims and families filed lawsuits against various parties, including the nightclub, social media companies accused of providing platforms for ISIS propaganda, and others alleged to bear some responsibility for enabling the attack. The Pulse nightclub massacre remains one of the deadliest and most significant terrorist attacks and hate crimes in American history, a tragedy that devastated a community and highlighted ongoing challenges related to extremism, gun violence, and the safety and acceptance of marginalized communities in American society. Number 4. Terrence Crutcher. Police shooting in Tulsa. On September 16, 2016, 40-year-old Terrence Crutcher, an unarmed black man, was shot and killed by Tulsa police officer Betty Jo Shelby in an incident that was captured on multiple videos and became another flashpoint in the national conversation about police use of force, racial bias in policing, and accountability for officers who kill civilians. The encounter began when Crutcher's vehicle broke down in the middle of 36th Street North in Tulsa, Oklahoma, leaving him stranded on a busy road as he attempted to deal with the mechanical failure. Officer Shelby, who was responding to an unrelated call in the area, encountered Crutcher's abandoned vehicle in the roadway and called for backup to assist with what appeared to be a traffic hazard. When Crutcher approached his vehicle, returning from an apparent attempt to seek help, Shelby engaged him, and what should have been a routine interaction rapidly escalated into a fatal confrontation. Video footage from multiple sources, including dashcam cameras from police vehicles and a helicopter circling overhead, captured the final minutes of Crutcher's life and provided a detailed record of the events that led to his death, though the interpretation of what those videos showed would become a matter of intense dispute between prosecutors, the defense, and the public. The helicopter footage, which was perhaps the most widely circulated, showed Crutcher walking toward his vehicle with his hands raised in the air, clearly visible and empty of any weapons or threatening objects. Multiple police officers surrounded Crutcher as he walked to his SUV, and at no point in the video does he appear to make sudden movements or display aggressive behavior toward the officers. As Crutcher reached the driver's side door of his vehicle, officers surrounded him more closely, and within seconds, he collapsed to the ground. Audio from the helicopter captured one of the officers in the aircraft commenting that Crutcher looked like a bad dude, a statement that would later be cited as evidence of the racial bias and assumptions that shaped officers' perceptions of Crutcher as threatening despite his compliance with commands and his lack of any visible weapon. Dashcam footage from patrol vehicles on the scene provided additional angles of the incident, showing officers with weapons drawn approaching Crutcher, who had his hands raised and appeared to be following instructions. Within moments of reaching his vehicle, Crutcher was both tossed and shot, with Officer Shelby firing a single gunshot that struck him in the chest while another officer deployed a taser. Crutcher fell to the ground immediately and lay bleeding on the pavement as officers approached and handcuffed him rather than immediately providing medical assistance. The delay in rendering aid to Crutcher, who was clearly critically wounded, became another source of controversy and anger, with many questioning why officers prioritized securing the scene and treating Crutcher as a threat even after he had been shot and incapacitated rather than immediately attempting to save his life. Medical personnel eventually arrived and transported Crutcher to St. Francis Hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival, the gunshot wound having caused massive internal injuries that proved fatal despite emergency surgery. The immediate aftermath of the shooting involved standard protocols, with Officer Shelby placed on administrative leave and the Tulsa Police Department initiating an internal investigation while also referring the case to the district attorney's office for review. However, the existence of video footage showing the entire encounter meant that public pressure for accountability built rapidly, with community activists and Crutcher's family demanding that Shelby be charged with a crime for what they characterized as the unjustified killing of an unarmed man who posed no threat and had committed no crime. The videos were released to the public within days of the shooting, sparking protests in Tulsa and adding Crutcher's name to the growing list of Black Americans killed by police in encounters that many viewed as evidence of systemic racism and excessive force. National civil rights leaders, including attorneys representing Crutcher's family, argued that the shooting reflected the danger that Black Americans face in any interaction with police, where the presumption of criminality and threat can lead to split-second decisions to use lethal force even when the person has done nothing to warrant such a response. The investigation into the shooting examined Officer Shelby's training, her perception of the threat Crutcher posed, and whether her use of deadly force was justified under the circumstances. Shelby claimed that she shot Crutcher because she believed he was reaching into his vehicle for a weapon, despite his hands being raised and visible in the moments before the shooting. She described Crutcher as not complying with her commands, though the video footage showed him walking with his hands up and appeared to contradict claims that he was actively resisting or threatening officers. Toxicology reports revealed that Crutcher had PCP in his system at the time of his death, a finding that Shelby's defenders cited as evidence that he may have been behaving erratically or may have possessed superhuman strength that made him dangerous, playing into racist stereotypes about black men and drug use that have long been used to justify excessive force. However, Crutcher's family and advocates pointed out that even if he was under the influence of drugs, he was unarmed, had his hands raised, and posed no imminent threat that would justify shooting him, and that the presence of drugs in his system did not give police license to execute him in the street. The investigation also revealed that Crutcher's vehicle window was closed when he was shot, meaning that Shelby's claim that he was reaching into the car for a weapon was physically impossible or at least highly questionable, as he could not have accessed the interior of the vehicle without first opening the door or window. No weapon was found in Crutcher's vehicle or on his person, confirming that he had been unarmed throughout the encounter and that Shelby's perception of a threat was unfounded. On September 22, 2016, just 6 days after the shooting, Tulsa County District Attorney Steve Kunzweiler announced that Officer Shelby would be charged with first-degree manslaughter, an unusually swift decision in a police shooting case that reflected the strength of the evidence against Shelby and the public pressure for accountability. The charge alleged that Shelby had killed Crutcher through culpable negligence and in the commission of a misdemeanor, specifically that her actions in shooting an unarmed man who posed no threat constituted an unjustified use of deadly force. Shelby turned herself in and was released on bail, maintaining her innocence and arguing that she had acted in accordance with her training and her perception of an imminent threat to her life. The trial, which took place in May 2017, became a test of whether the criminal justice system could hold police officers accountable for killings that many viewed as unjustified but that officers claimed were split-second decisions made in good faith based on their perception of danger. The prosecution presented the video evidence, which they argued clearly showed Crutcher complying with officers and posing no threat, along with expert testimony about police use of force standards and whether Shelby's actions were reasonable under the circumstances. Prosecutors emphasized that Crutcher was unarmed, had his hands raised, and that Shelby had other options available short of lethal force, including waiting for backup, using verbal commands, or employing less lethal weapons. The defense argued that Shelby had acted reasonably based on her training and her perception that Crutcher was refusing to comply with commands and was reaching for a weapon, emphasizing the split-second nature of police decision-making and the need for officers to be able to protect themselves without the benefit of hindsight. Defense attorneys presented testimony from use-of-force experts who supported Shelby's actions and from witnesses who described Crutcher's behavior as erratic, attempting to paint a picture of a dangerous situation in which Shelby had no choice but to shoot. The jury, after deliberating for several days, acquitted Shelby of the manslaughter charge on May 17, 2017, a verdict that devastated Crutcher's family and sparked renewed protests and criticisms of a justice system that rarely holds police officers criminally accountable for killings. The acquittal reflected the high burden of proof required in criminal cases and the tendency of juries to defer to police officers' claims that they feared for their lives, even when video evidence appears to contradict those claims. Following the criminal trial, Crutcher's family pursued civil litigation against the city of Tulsa and Officer Shelby, seeking compensation for his wrongful death and policy changes to prevent similar shootings. The city ultimately settled the civil lawsuit, though the terms were not publicly disclosed, and committed to implementing reforms to police training and accountability measures. Officer Shelby, despite being acquitted of criminal charges, was ultimately not returned to duty with the Tulsa Police Department and instead took a position teaching a course on surviving the perils of active shooter situations at a community college. A career move that many found disturbingly ironic given that she had killed an unarmed man. The Terrence Crutcher shooting joined a long list of police killings of unarmed Black Americans that have driven the Black Lives Matter movement and demands for police reform, including changes to use of force policies, better training in de-escalation tactics, increased accountability and transparency in investigations of police shootings, and cultural changes within law enforcement to address implicit bias and the assumptions that lead officers to perceive Black Americans as threatening even when they pose no actual danger. Crutcher's death was particularly significant because of the video evidence showing the entire encounter, which many believed should have made it impossible to justify the shooting and should have resulted in a conviction. Yet the acquittal demonstrated the difficulty of obtaining criminal accountability for police officers even when their actions are captured on camera. The case also highlighted broader questions about how society values Black lives and whether the criminal justice system can provide equal protection and justice when police officers are the perpetrators of violence. For Crutcher's family, including his twin sister Tiffany Crutcher, who became a vocal advocate for police reform and an eloquent spokesperson about her brother's killing, the acquittal represented a miscarriage of justice but also motivated continued activism to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. The legacy of Terrence Crutcher's death includes not just the pain of his loss, but also the ongoing fight for accountability, transparency, and systemic change in American policing, a fight that continues as police shootings of unarmed civilians remain far too common and prosecutions and convictions of officers remain far too rare. The case serves as a reminder that video evidence alone is often insufficient to overcome the deference that legal systems grant to police officers and the assumptions about danger and threat that shape perceptions of encounters between police and Black Americans, and that achieving meaningful change will require not just individual prosecutions but fundamental reforms to how police are trained, supervised, and held accountable for their actions. Number 5. Gypsy Rose Blanchard. The murder of D.D. Blanchard. On June 14, 2015, police in Springfield, Missouri, discovered the body of 48-year-old Claudine D.D. Blanchard stabbed to death in her home, a murder that initially appeared to be a tragic crime against a devoted mother who had spent years caring for her severely disabled daughter, but which quickly unraveled into one of the most disturbing cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy ever documented and a story of abuse, desperation, and violence that captured national attention. Though the murder occurred in 2015, the legal proceedings and sentencing of those involved took place in 2016, making it one of the most discussed and debated criminal cases of that year. D.D. Blanchard had presented herself and her daughter Gypsy Rose to their community, to medical professionals, and to charitable organizations as a pair united by tragedy and perseverance, with D.D. playing the role of selfless caretaker to Gypsy, who she claimed suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, and severe developmental disabilities that left her unable to walk and functioning at the level of a young child despite being in her early 20s. The two had been recipients of enormous generosity and sympathy, including a house built for them by Habitat for Humanity after they claimed to have lost everything in Hurricane Katrina, medical care provided free or at reduced cost by doctors who believed they were helping a severely ill child, and financial support from various charities and fundraisers organized by community members moved by their story. D.D. homeschooled Gypsy, managed all her medical care, and controlled every aspect of her life, maintaining the facade of devoted motherhood while actually subjecting her daughter to years of unnecessary medical procedures, medications, and restrictions based on fabricated illnesses. The reality, which would only emerge fully in the aftermath of the murder, was that Gypsy Rose was not disabled at all, could walk, did not have muscular dystrophy or leukemia or any of the other conditions her mother claimed, and had been forced to play the role of a sick child for virtually her entire life by a mother who suffered from severe mental illness and who gained attention, sympathy, and financial benefits from presenting her daughter as disabled. Dee Dee had subjected Gypsy to dozens of unnecessary surgeries, including the removal of her salivary glands and teeth, had forced her to use a wheelchair and feeding tube despite her ability to walk and eat normally, had shaved her head to mimic the appearance of chemotherapy patients, and had isolated her from peers and from any relationships that might expose the truth about her condition. Medical records would later show that different doctors had questioned some of Dee Dee's claims about Gypsy's health, with some noting that test results didn't support diagnoses of the conditions Dee Dee described. But Dee Dee had been skilled at doctor shopping, moving between different providers whenever anyone became too suspicious, and presenting herself as a desperate mother fighting to get proper care for her daughter in the face of skeptical or incompetent medical professionals. For Gypsy, the realization that she was not actually sick, that her mother had been lying to her and to everyone else, came gradually as she grew older and began to understand that her body could do things her mother claimed were impossible. She secretly taught herself to walk when her mother wasn't watching, researched her supposed conditions online when she could access the internet without Dee Dee's knowledge, and began to recognize that she was a prisoner in her own life, controlled by a mother whose love was actually a form of profound abuse. Gypsy's attempts to escape or to reveal the truth were met with violence and tighter control from Dee Dee, who had once chained Gypsy to her bed for days as punishment after she tried to run away with a boyfriend she had met at a science fiction convention. The isolation and abuse Gypsy experienced left her desperate for freedom but unsure how to achieve it given her mother's total control over her life and identity. In 2012, Gypsy created a secret profile on a Christian dating website where she met Nicholas Gojan, a young man from Wisconsin who had his own history of mental health issues and who would become Gypsy's boyfriend through online communications that she hid from her mother. Over the next 3 years, Gypsy and Nicholas developed a relationship conducted almost entirely through secret online messages and phone calls, with Gypsy confiding in Nicholas about the abuse she suffered and the two of them eventually conspiring to kill Dee Dee as the only way Gypsy could see to escape her mother's control. The murder plot developed over several months, with Gypsy and Nicholas discussing various methods and eventually settling on a plan in which Nicholas would come to Springfield, enter the house while Dee Dee slept, and stab her to death while Gypsy hid in another room. On June 10, 2015, Nicholas traveled from Wisconsin to Missouri, and in the early morning hours of June 11th, he entered the Blanchard home, went to Dee Dee's bedroom, and stabbed her 17 times, killing her while Gypsy waited in the bathroom, hearing her mother's screams but not intervening. After the murder, Gypsy and Nicholas took money from the house, fled to Wisconsin where they stayed in a motel, and had sex for the first time, with Gypsy later describing a sense of freedom and relief at finally being out from under her mother's control. However, the couple's celebration was short-lived, as concerned neighbors who had seen disturbing Facebook posts on Dee Dee's account, which Gypsy had made to alert people to the murder, called police to check on the Blanchards. When officers arrived at the house and discovered Dee Dee's body, they initially feared that Gypsy, who was nowhere to be found, had been kidnapped or killed as well, and an urgent search began for the young woman who everyone believed to be severely disabled and vulnerable. The investigation quickly took an unexpected turn when police traced the Facebook posts to an account in Nicholas Gojan's name and discovered that Gypsy was not missing but rather had left willingly with her boyfriend. When police located Gypsy and Nicholas in Wisconsin and took them into custody, investigators were shocked to discover that Gypsy could walk, appeared healthy and much older than her mother had claimed she was, and showed none of the disabilities that Dee Dee had described. As Gypsy told her story to detectives, the full scope of Dee Dee's abuse and the elaborate deception she had maintained for years became clear, transforming the case from a simple murder investigation into a complex examination of abuse, mental illness, and the question of culpability when someone kills their abuser. Gypsy was charged with first-degree murder along with Nicholas, and the legal proceedings that followed in 2016 grappled with how to balance justice for Dee Dee's killing with recognition of the extraordinary abuse Gypsy had suffered and the limited options she had perceived for escaping her mother's control. Gypsy's defense team argued that she had been a victim of severe, long-term abuse that had left her psychologically damaged and desperate, and that while she participated in planning her mother's murder, she did so only because she saw no other way to free herself from a situation that had destroyed her childhood and threatened to continue for the rest of her life. The prosecution acknowledged the abuse Gypsy had suffered but argued that she had other options available, including reporting the abuse to authorities or seeking help from the many people who had shown concern for her welfare over the years, and that premeditated murder could not be excused even when the victim had been an abuser. Public opinion on the case was deeply divided, with some viewing Gypsy as a victim who had acted in self-defense or under extreme duress and who deserved compassion and leniency, while others argued that she had manipulated a vulnerable man with mental health issues into committing murder on her behalf, and that the premeditation and brutality of Dee Dee's killing warranted serious punishment. In July 2016, Gypsy accepted a plea bargain in which she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 10 years in prison, a resolution that both prosecutors and defense attorneys characterized as fair given the complex circumstances of the case. At her sentencing hearing, Gypsy expressed remorse for her mother's death while also describing the abuse she had endured and her belief that killing Dee Dee had been her only path to freedom. The judge acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the case while emphasizing that murder is never an acceptable solution to even severe abuse and that Gypsy needed to take responsibility for her actions. Nicholas Gojon proceeded to trial and was convicted of first-degree murder in November 2018, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, a much harsher punishment than Gypsy received, reflecting both his direct role in the killing and the jury's conclusion that he did not face the same abuse or coercion that might have mitigated Gypsy's culpability. The case of Gypsy Rose and Dee Dee Blanchard has been the subject of extensive media coverage, including documentaries, news specials, and a Hulu series titled The Act that dramatized the story and brought it to an even wider audience. The case highlighted the dangers of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a form of abuse in which caregivers fabricate or induce illness in those under their care to gain attention and sympathy, and the ways that such abuse can go undetected even when victims are in regular contact with medical professionals, educators, and community members who might otherwise notice signs of maltreatment. The failures of various systems to identify and stop Dee Dee's abuse of Gypsy, despite numerous opportunities when doctors, nurses, or social workers might have questioned her claims or investigated more thoroughly, raised important questions about how medical professionals are trained to recognize Munchausen by proxy and how to balance trust in parents' accounts of their children's health with appropriate skepticism when claims seem inconsistent with observable evidence. The case also sparked debate about the appropriate legal response when abuse victims kill their abusers, with advocates for domestic violence survivors arguing that the criminal justice system often fails to account for the psychological impact of long-term abuse and the limited options available to victims trapped in situations of control and violence. Some argued that Gypsy should not have been prosecuted at all given the extreme abuse she suffered, while others maintained that allowing victims to kill their abusers would set a dangerous precedent and that society must maintain other avenues for people to escape abuse without resorting to violence. Gypsy Rose Blanchard is currently serving her sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri, where she has given interviews about her case and her life in prison, describing a sense of freedom she never had while living with her mother despite the restrictions of incarceration. She has expressed hope for her future after release and has maintained a relationship with Nicholas Gojon's family while distancing herself from Nicholas himself, recognizing that their relationship was formed under extraordinary circumstances and involved mutual manipulation and dysfunction. Gypsy's case remains one of the most complex and disturbing criminal cases in recent memory, a story that defies easy moral judgments and that raises profound questions about abuse, autonomy, mental illness, and the limits of legal categories in capturing the full reality of human experience and suffering. Number 6. Keith Lamont Scott. Police shooting in Charlotte. On September 20, 2016, 43-year-old Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed by Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officer Brentley Vinson in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Charlotte, North Carolina. In an incident that sparked several days of protests and civil unrest in the city and added another case to the national conversation about police shootings of Black Americans and the need for accountability and reform in law enforcement. The circumstances of the shooting remained contested, with police claiming that Scott was armed with a handgun and posed a threat that justified the use of deadly force, while Scott's family insisted that he was holding a book, not a gun, and that he was sitting in his vehicle waiting to pick up his son from school when police confronted him. The encounter began when plainclothes officers from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department's warrant service team arrived at the Village at College Downs apartment complex to serve an arrest warrant on a different individual who was wanted on outstanding charges. While setting up their operation, officers noticed Scott sitting in an SUV in the parking lot and claimed they observed him rolling what appeared to be a marijuana cigarette, a minor offense that would not typically warrant police intervention, particularly when officers were focused on serving a warrant on someone else. However, officers also claimed they saw Scott in possession of a handgun, which they stated prompted them to approach his vehicle and order him to drop the weapon. What happened next became the subject of intense dispute, with police claiming that Scott exited his vehicle while armed, ignored multiple commands to drop the gun, and posed an imminent threat that forced Officer Vinson, who is also Black, to fire his weapon 4 times, striking Scott and inflicting fatal injuries. Scott's family and witnesses told a different story, insisting that Scott was not armed, that he was disabled following a traumatic brain injury in a motorcycle accident years earlier, and that he would not have understood or been able to comply with rapid-fire police commands in a tense situation. The shooting was captured on multiple videos, including dashcam footage from police vehicles and cell phone video recorded by Scott's wife, Rekia Scott, who arrived on the scene as the confrontation was unfolding and who can be heard on the recording pleading with officers not to shoot her husband and stating repeatedly that he was not armed and had a traumatic brain injury. The video footage, when eventually released to the public after days of pressure from community members and civil rights activists, showed Scott exiting his vehicle and backing away from police officers who had their weapons drawn and were shouting commands at him, though the footage did not definitively resolve the question of whether Scott was holding a gun or whether his actions posed a threat sufficient to justify deadly force. In the dashcam video, Scott appears to be holding something in his hand, but the object is not clearly identifiable as a weapon, and he does not point it at officers or make any overtly aggressive movements in the moments before Officer Vinson fires. Scott falls to the ground after being shot, and officers immediately move in to handcuff him rather than providing medical assistance, a pattern seen in many police shooting cases that has drawn criticism from those who argue that officers should prioritize saving lives over securing scenes. Emergency medical personnel arrived and transported Scott to Carolina's Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead from his injuries. The immediate aftermath of the shooting saw Charlotte police initially refuse to release the video footage, citing the ongoing investigation and North Carolina state law that did not require such disclosure, a decision that fueled suspicion and anger in the community and led to protests that began peacefully but escalated into violence and property destruction as frustration boiled over. Protesters gathered in the streets of Charlotte, blocking highways, confronting police, and in some cases engaging in looting and vandalism that resulted in property damage and led to the deployment of the National Guard to help restore order. The protests reflected not just anger about Scott's death, but broader frustration with patterns of police violence against Black Americans, economic inequality, and the sense that African American communities are over-policed and underprotected. One protester, 43-year-old Justin Carr, was shot and killed during the demonstrations in what police described as a civilian-on-civilian shooting unrelated to law enforcement actions, though his death added to the tragedy and tension of the events. After several days of unrest and mounting pressure, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Chief Kerr Putney released portions of the dashcam and body camera footage, along with statements defending Officer Vinson's actions and asserting that Scott had been armed with a handgun that was recovered at the scene. The gun, which police said had been stolen and was loaded with a bullet in the chamber, became a central piece of evidence, though questions remained about how it could be definitively linked to Scott and whether it had actually been in his hand at the moment he was shot. Some witnesses and advocates suggested that the gun might have been planted by officers seeking to justify the shooting, allegations that police vehemently denied, but that reflected the deep distrust between law enforcement and communities of color built on decades of excessive force, racial profiling, and officers escaping accountability for unjustified shootings. The investigation into Scott's death was conducted by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, which reviewed physical evidence, witness statements, and the video footage before presenting its findings to the district attorney's office. The investigation confirmed that a gun had been found at the scene with Scott's DNA and fingerprints on it, though this evidence did not definitively prove that he had been holding it when he was shot or that he had posed a threat to officers. Investigators also noted that Scott had THC in his system, a finding that police and some media outlets emphasized despite its questionable relevance to whether the shooting was justified, echoing patterns in other cases where victims' drug use or criminal histories are highlighted to shift blame away from officers and suggest that victims somehow deserved what happened to them. On November 30, 2016, Mecklenburg County District Attorney Andrew Murray announced that Officer Vinson would not face criminal charges for Scott's death, concluding that the evidence supported Vinson's claim that he had acted in self-defense and had reasonably believed that Scott posed an imminent threat. The decision not to prosecute was expected by many given the rarity of criminal charges against police officers in shooting cases, but it nonetheless sparked renewed anger and protests from those who believed that Scott's death was unjustified and that the criminal justice system had once again failed to hold law enforcement accountable. District Attorney Murray held a press conference in which he presented evidence and explained his decision, including showing additional video footage and photographs of the gun recovered at the scene. But the presentation did little to satisfy those who questioned the investigation's thoroughness and objectivity. Scott's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Charlotte and Officer Vinson, and the case was eventually settled in 2018 for an undisclosed amount, with the city agreeing to pay the family without admitting any wrongdoing or accepting that the shooting had been unjustified. As part of the settlement discussions and in response to the protests and unrest following Scott's death, the city of Charlotte committed to various police reforms, including changes to body camera policies, additional training in de-escalation and implicit bias, and increased community oversight of police practices. Though advocates continued to push for more comprehensive changes, including independent investigations of police shootings and greater transparency in releasing evidence and information to the public. Officer Vinson returned to duty after being cleared of criminal charges, though he was assigned to administrative duties rather than patrol work, and the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department continued to defend the shooting as justified while also acknowledging the need for better community relations and trust-building efforts. The Keith Lamont Scott shooting joined a long list of police killings that have driven demands for reform and accountability, including the deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Eric Garner in New York, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Walter Scott in South Carolina, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Philando Castile in Minnesota, and many others whose names have become rallying cries for the Black Lives Matter movement and for broader efforts to address systemic racism in American policing. Each of these cases shares common elements, including disputed circumstances of what led to the shooting, questions about whether less lethal force could have been used, the rarity of criminal charges or convictions for officers involved, and the devastating impact on families and communities who lose loved ones to police violence. The Scott case was particularly significant because it occurred in Charlotte, a city that had previously been seen as having relatively good police-community relations compared to other major cities, and the unrest that followed the shooting demonstrated that tensions over policing and racial justice exist even in communities that believe they have avoided the problems seen elsewhere. The case also highlighted the limitations of body camera and dashcam footage in resolving disputes about police shootings, as even with multiple videos capturing the incident, questions remained about what Scott was holding, whether he posed a threat, and whether officers could have used tactics other than deadly force to resolve the situation. For Rakia Scott, who watched her husband die and recorded the encounter on her phone, the shooting represented an unimaginable trauma that was compounded by the public scrutiny of her video, the protests and unrest that followed, and the decision not to hold anyone criminally accountable for her husband's death. She became an advocate for police reform and transparency, speaking publicly about her loss and her desire to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Though the pain of her husband's death remained an open wound that no amount of activism or policy change could fully heal. The legacy of Keith Lamont Scott's death includes not just his family's ongoing grief, but also the continued struggle for police accountability and for a reimagining of public safety that prioritizes preservation of life, de-escalation, and community trust over the quick resort to lethal force that has cost so many lives and devastated so many communities, particularly communities of color who bear a disproportionate burden of police violence and who have led the movement demanding change. Number 7. Philando Castile. Police shooting in Minnesota. On July 6, 2016, 32-year-old Philando Castile was shot and killed by St. Anthony Police Department officer Geronimo Yanez during a traffic stop in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, a suburb of St. Paul, in a killing that was partially live-streamed on Facebook by Castile's girlfriend Diamond Reynolds, and that became one of the most widely viewed and discussed police shootings in American history. The traffic stop began when Officer Yanez pulled over the car that Castile was driving, with Reynolds in the passenger seat and her 4-year-old daughter in the back. Ostensibly because of a broken tail light, though Yanez later testified that he had also suspected Castile might match the description of a robbery suspect, a claim that was never substantiated and that many viewed as a post hoc justification for a stop motivated by racial profiling. Castile, who worked as a cafeteria supervisor at J.J. Hill Montessori Magnet School in St. Paul, where he was beloved by students and staff for his kindness and the care he showed in ensuring children had enough to eat, was a lawful gun owner with a permit to carry a concealed weapon, and he had a licensed firearm in his vehicle at the time of the stop. According to Reynolds' account and the video she recorded, when Officer Yanez approached the vehicle, Castile calmly informed him that he had a firearm and that he was licensed to carry it, fulfilling his legal obligation to disclose the presence of the weapon and attempting to ensure that the officer would not be surprised or alarmed if he happened to see it. What happened next occurred within seconds and resulted in Castile's death in front of his girlfriend and her young daughter, as Officer Yanez, apparently panicking at the disclosure that Castile had a gun, ordered him not to reach for it and then fired 7 shots into the vehicle, striking Castile multiple times in the chest and arm. Reynolds began filming with her phone immediately after the shooting, capturing footage that would be seen by millions of people worldwide and that showed Castile slumped in the driver's seat, bleeding from his wounds, while Officer Yanez continued to point his weapon at the car and can be heard on the video repeatedly saying he told Castile not to reach for the gun. Reynolds, remaining remarkably calm despite the trauma of watching her boyfriend shot in front of her, narrated what had happened for the camera, explaining that Castile had been reaching for his wallet to get his license and registration as the officer had requested, not reaching for his gun, and that he had done everything right by informing the officer about the weapon and complying with instructions. The video, which Reynolds streamed live on Facebook, showed the immediate aftermath of the shooting in graphic detail, including Castile's labored breathing, the blood soaking his white shirt, and the 4-year-old child in the back seat witnessing the entire horrific scene. Officer Yanez, clearly in a state of shock and panic himself, ordered Reynolds out of the car at gunpoint and handcuffed her, separating her from the child and detaining her for hours while Castile bled out in the vehicle. Other officers arrived on the scene and attempted to provide medical aid to Castile, but his injuries were catastrophic and he was pronounced dead at Hennepin County Medical Center shortly after arrival, having been shot multiple times at point-blank range with bullets that tore through vital organs and caused massive internal bleeding. The investigation into the shooting began immediately, with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension taking the lead in examining the evidence and determining whether criminal charges were warranted. The investigation faced challenges in reconstructing exactly what had happened in the seconds before Yanez fired, as there was no dashcam or body camera footage capturing Castile's actions inside the vehicle before the shooting, though there was audio from the dashcam that recorded the verbal exchange between Castile and Yanez. The dashcam audio captured Castile saying, "I have to reach for it," shortly before Yanez opened fire, with Castile apparently trying to comply with the officer's request for his license and registration, while also attempting to reassure Yanez that he was not reaching for his gun. But the audio also captured Yanez's panicked commands and the rapid escalation from calm traffic stop to deadly shooting in a matter of seconds. The investigation confirmed that Castile had a valid permit to carry a concealed weapon and that the gun he had in the car was legally owned and possessed, undermining any suggestion that he had been engaged in criminal activity or had any reason to threaten an officer. Toxicology tests revealed that Castile had THC in his system, a finding that Yanez's defenders cited as potentially affecting his behavior or judgment, though there was no evidence that he was impaired at the time of the stop, and the presence of marijuana metabolites in his blood had no bearing on whether the shooting was justified. Family and friends described Castile as a gentle, peaceful man who had no history of violence and who had been taught from a young age how to interact with police during traffic stops to avoid exactly the kind of tragedy that ultimately cost him his life, following his mother's instructions to keep his hands visible, to comply with officers' commands, and to avoid any sudden movements that might be perceived as threatening. Despite doing everything he had been taught to do, Castile was killed anyway, a reality that devastated his family and that highlighted the impossible position that Black Americans find themselves in during police encounters, where even complete compliance offers no guarantee of safety. On November 16, 2016, Ramsey County Attorney John Choi announced that Officer Yanez would be charged with second-degree manslaughter, a significant decision given the rarity of criminal charges against police officers in shooting cases and one that reflected the strength of the evidence and the public pressure for accountability. The manslaughter charge alleged that Yanez had caused Castile's death through culpable negligence by creating an unreasonable risk and consciously taking chances of causing death or great bodily harm. Specifically, that his decision to fire multiple shots into the vehicle was unjustified given the circumstances. The announcement of charges brought some measure of hope to Castile's family and supporters, though they also noted that the charge was less serious than murder and carried a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison, far less than they believed Castile's life was worth. The trial began in May 2017 and lasted several weeks, with the prosecution presenting evidence that Yanez had overreacted to the disclosure that Castile had a gun and had fired without confirming that Castile was actually reaching for the weapon or posed any real threat. Prosecutors argued that a reasonable officer in the same situation would not have perceived Castile's actions as threatening and would have used verbal commands, repositioning, or other tactics short of deadly force to maintain safety. The prosecution also emphasized Castile's compliance with the law in obtaining a carry permit and his attempt to inform the officer about the gun's presence, arguing that Yanez had essentially punished Castile for trying to do the right thing. Diamond Reynolds testified about what she had witnessed, describing Castile as calm and compliant throughout the stop and insisting that he had been reaching for his wallet, not his gun. The defense argued that Yanez had acted reasonably based on his training and his perception of an imminent threat, emphasizing the split-second nature of police decision-making and the danger that officers face during traffic stops when they learn that a driver is armed. Defense attorneys presented expert testimony about police use of force and human perception, arguing that Yanez had to make a life-or-death decision in a matter of seconds based on incomplete information, and that his decision to shoot was a tragic but reasonable response to a situation in which he believed his life was in danger. The defense also emphasized that Castile had not followed Yanez's commands to not reach for the gun, though this argument was complicated by the fact that Castile appeared to be reaching for his license and registration, which Yanez had requested, creating a contradictory set of instructions that may have left Castile unsure how to comply. On June 16, 2017, after deliberating for approximately 29 hours over 5 days, the jury acquitted Officer Yanez of all charges, a verdict that shocked many observers and sparked immediate protests and expressions of grief and anger from Castile's family and the broader community. The acquittal meant that no one would be held criminally accountable for Castile's death, despite video evidence showing the aftermath of the shooting and despite widespread agreement that the shooting had been a tragedy that should have been prevented. Following the acquittal, the City of St. Anthony and the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust agreed to a settlement with Castile's family that included a payment of approximately $3 million, one of the largest settlements in a police shooting case in Minnesota history, though no amount of money could compensate for the loss of Castile's life. The city also agreed to remove Officer Yanez from the police force, with Yanez and city officials reaching a separation agreement that ended his law enforcement career, though he received a buyout of his contract rather than being fired for cause. The Philando Castile shooting had profound impacts on discussions of gun rights, police accountability, and the intersection of race and firearms in America. The case highlighted the reality that the Second Amendment right to bear arms has not been equally protected for Black Americans, who face a heightened risk of being killed by police when they exercise their right to carry firearms legally. The National Rifle Association, which typically defends gun owners against what it perceives as government overreach, was notably silent about Castile's killing for an extended period, eventually making tepid comments that many interpreted as insufficient given the organization's usual aggressive defense of gun rights, and critics argued that the NRA's lack of strong advocacy for Castile revealed the organization's primary concern is protecting white gun owners rather than defending the Second Amendment rights of all Americans. The case also demonstrated once again the difficulty of holding police officers accountable through the criminal justice system, as juries are often reluctant to convict officers even when evidence suggests that a shooting was unjustified, deferring to officers' claims that they feared for their lives and accepting arguments about the split-second nature of police decision-making, even when those decisions result in the death of innocent people. For Diamond Reynolds and her daughter, who witnessed Castile's killing and its immediate aftermath, the trauma of that day has been lasting and profound, with both requiring ongoing therapy and support to cope with what they experienced. The 4-year-old girl who was in the back seat during the shooting grew up with the knowledge that she had witnessed a man she cared about being killed by police, an experience that child psychologists have described as deeply damaging and that represents one of the many often overlooked victims of police violence. The children and other bystanders who witness such shootings and carry the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Castile's mother, Valerie Castile, became an advocate for police reform and for changes to how officers are trained to interact with lawfully armed citizens, speaking publicly about her son's death and pushing for policies that might prevent similar tragedies. The school where Philando Castile worked honored his memory and the impact he had on students' lives, with many sharing stories about his kindness, his dedication to ensuring that no child went hungry, and the personal relationships he built with students who saw him not just as a cafeteria worker, but as a caring adult who looked out for them. His death represented a loss not just to his family and friends, but to the entire school community and to the hundreds of children whose lives he had touched through his work. The Philando Castile shooting remains one of the most significant and widely discussed police killings in recent American history, a case that was supposed to be different because it was captured on video, because the victim was clearly not a threat, because he had done everything right, and yet it ended the same way as so many other cases, with an officer walking free and a family left to grieve a loss that should never have occurred and that reflected the ongoing crisis of police violence against Black Americans and the systemic failures that enable such violence to continue without meaningful accountability or change. Number 8. Larry Nassar. Sexual abuse scandal exposed. In 2016, the extent of Dr. Larry Nassar's decades-long sexual abuse of young gymnasts and other athletes began to emerge publicly, setting in motion one of the most significant child sexual abuse cases in American history and exposing catastrophic failures by institutions including USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and law enforcement agencies that had enabled Nassar to victimize hundreds of girls and young women over more than 20 years. Though Nassar had begun abusing athletes as early as the 1990s and complaints had been made about his behavior to various authorities over the years, It was not until 2016 that criminal charges were filed and that the full scope of his predation became public knowledge, leading to criminal proceedings that would culminate in 2017 and 2018 with Nassar receiving multiple lengthy prison sentences and with numerous victims delivering powerful impact statements that gave voice to the harm he had caused and the institutions that had protected him. Larry Nassar had been a respected sports medicine doctor who served as the USA Gymnastics national team physician and as an osteopathic physician at Michigan State University, positions that gave him access to elite gymnasts and other young athletes, and that came with a level of trust and authority that he systematically exploited to sexually abuse his patients under the guise of legitimate medical treatment. Nassar's abuse typically occurred during what he described as medical procedures to treat various ailments, particularly pelvic floor dysfunction and back or hip pain, during which he would penetrate his victims vaginally or anally with his ungloved hands without their consent and without any medical justification. He would often perform these assaults with the victim's parents present in the room, positioning himself so that the parents could not see what he was doing and convincing both the young athletes and their parents that the procedures were necessary and proper medical treatment. The trust that parents and athletes placed in Nassar as a physician, combined with the culture of compliance and endurance in elite gymnastics that discouraged athletes from questioning authority or speaking up about discomfort, created conditions in which Nassar could abuse his victims repeatedly over extended periods without being stopped. Many of his victims were young teenagers or preteens, children who were training at elite levels in gymnastics or other sports and who viewed Nassar as a crucial part of their medical care and their ability to continue competing. The abuse often began with legitimate medical examination that gradually escalated into sexual assault, with Nassar normalizing inappropriate touching by presenting it as standard treatment and by maintaining a friendly, affable demeanor that made his victims question their own discomfort and hesitate to report what they were experiencing. The first public allegations against Nassar came in August 2016 when the Indianapolis Star published an investigation into USA Gymnastics' handling of sexual abuse allegations, which included reporting that multiple coaches had been banned for sexual misconduct and that the organization had failed to properly report allegations to law enforcement. Though the initial article did not name Nassar, it prompted former gymnast Rachel Denhollander to come forward publicly with allegations that Nassar had sexually abused her during medical appointments when she was 15 years old, filing a criminal complaint with Michigan State University Police and speaking on the record to the Indianapolis Star. Denhollander's decision to identify herself and to detail the abuse she had suffered, despite the personal costs and the likelihood that she would face skepticism and victim blaming, proved to be a watershed moment that encouraged other victims to come forward and that finally prompted law enforcement to take serious action against Nassar. The investigation that followed uncovered evidence of sexual abuse involving more than 300 victims over more than 2 decades, making Nassar one of the most prolific sexual predators in recent American history and revealing catastrophic failures by multiple institutions that should have protected young athletes but instead enabled their abuse. The investigation revealed that concerns about Nassar's behavior had been raised repeatedly over the years but had been dismissed or ignored by USA Gymnastics officials, Michigan State University administrators, and local law enforcement. In 2014, USA Gymnastics had received complaints from multiple gymnasts about Nassar's treatment methods, and the organization had conducted an internal investigation that should have resulted in immediate reporting to law enforcement and removal of Nassar from positions where he had access to athletes. Instead, USA Gymnastics officials allowed Nassar to continue treating athletes for more than a year after receiving the complaints, failing to report the allegations to law enforcement or to warn Michigan State University, where Nassar continued to see patients. A delay that allowed him to abuse dozens of additional victims who could have been protected if the organization had taken prompt action. Similarly, Michigan State University had received a complaint about Nassar in 2014 from an athlete who reported that his treatment had made her uncomfortable, and the university had conducted a cursory investigation that concluded Nassar's techniques were legitimate medical procedures, accepting his explanations without consulting with medical experts who could have confirmed that his actions had no medical justification. The university's investigation failed to uncover the pattern of abuse that had been ongoing for years, and Nasser was allowed to continue treating patients at the university and at his private practice. Law enforcement failures were equally significant, with reports that local police had been contacted about Nasser as early as 2004 but had declined to investigate, accepting explanations that the touching was medical treatment rather than sexual abuse. Even when investigations finally began in 2016, they proceeded slowly and at times seemed designed to protect institutions rather than victims, with Michigan State University initially defending Nasser and questioning the credibility of the women who accused him. The criminal charges against Nasser eventually included both federal charges related to possession of child pornography, which investigators discovered when executing a search warrant at his home in connection with the sexual abuse allegations, and state charges for criminal sexual conduct involving multiple victims over many years. The child pornography charges, which included evidence that Nasser had amassed a large collection of images depicting child sexual abuse, provided prosecutors with a case that was easier to prove than some of the sexual abuse charges, and that resulted in Nasser pleading guilty to federal charges in July 2017 and receiving a sentence of 60 years in federal prison. However, it was the state criminal sexual conduct cases that would provide victims with their most powerful opportunity to confront Nasser and to make public statements about the impact of his abuse. Nasser eventually pleaded guilty to 7 counts of criminal sexual conduct in Ingham County, Michigan, and to 3 additional counts in neighboring Eaton County, admitting to sexually assaulting minors under the guise of medical treatment and acknowledging that his actions had no legitimate medical purpose. The plea agreements included provisions allowing victims to make impact statements at sentencing, and the sentencing hearings, which took place in January and February 2018, became historic events in which more than 150 women and girls testified about Nasser's abuse and its devastating effects on their lives. The victim impact statements, which were broadcast live and attracted widespread media attention, provided a rare opportunity for sexual abuse survivors to be heard and believed on a public stage, and the testimonies were powerful, heartbreaking, and often angry as victims described not just the physical violations they had endured but the psychological damage, the trust that had been shattered, the careers that had been derailed, the relationships that had been affected, and the years of suffering they had endured while carrying the secret of their abuse. Olympic gold medalists including Simone Biles, Ali Raisman, and Michaela Maroney eventually came forward as Nasser victims, revealing that even the most successful and famous athletes had not been protected from his predation and that his abuse had extended to the highest levels of the sport. The testimonies also included searing indictments of the institutions that had enabled Nasser's abuse, with victims describing how USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and other organizations had failed to protect them, had dismissed their concerns, and had prioritized institutional reputation and legal liability over the safety and well-being of young athletes. Judge Rosemary Aquilina, who presided over the Ingham County sentencing hearing, allowed all victims who wished to speak to do so, even as the hearing stretched over several days, and she provided a platform for their voices to be heard and validated in a way that is unfortunately rare in sexual abuse cases. In her sentencing remarks, Judge Aquilina condemned Nasser's actions and the institutions that had enabled him, telling him that she had just signed his death warrant as she imposed a sentence of 40 to 175 years in state prison, to be served after his federal sentence, ensuring that Nasser would die in prison. The Eaton County sentencing, presided over by Judge Janice Cunningham, resulted in an additional sentence of 40 to 125 years in state prison, with more victims providing impact statements and describing the abuse they had suffered. The cumulative sentences meant that Nasser, who was in his 50s at the time of sentencing, would never be released from prison, a measure of justice that victims and their advocates welcomed, though many emphasized that no sentence could undo the harm that had been done or compensate for the years of abuse that could have been prevented if institutions had acted responsibly. The Nasser case had far-reaching consequences beyond his criminal conviction and imprisonment. USA Gymnastics faced widespread condemnation for its handling of abuse allegations and its culture of prioritizing medals and success over athlete welfare, leading to the resignation of numerous top officials, the revocation of the organization's status as the national governing body for the sport, and bankruptcy proceedings as it faced hundreds of lawsuits from Nassar's victims. Michigan State University also faced intense scrutiny and ultimately agreed to a settlement of $500 million to be paid to Nassar's victims, one of the largest settlements in a sexual abuse case and an acknowledgement of the university's failures to protect students and to properly investigate complaints. The university's president and other top administrators resigned, and the institution faced ongoing questions about its culture and its commitment to addressing sexual misconduct. The case also prompted broader conversations about how institutions handle sexual abuse allegations, the tendency to protect reputations and minimize liability rather than prioritize victim safety, and the need for mandatory reporting requirements, independent investigations, and cultural changes that empower victims to come forward and ensure that allegations are taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The gymnasts who survived Nassar's abuse became powerful advocates for systemic change, using their platforms to demand accountability not just from Nassar but from the institutions and individuals who enabled him, and their advocacy contributed to broader movements like Me Too and Time's Up that have sought to address sexual harassment and assault across multiple contexts. The Nassar case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of young athletes in elite sports environments, where power imbalances between coaches, doctors, and athletes, combined with cultures that emphasize obedience and discourage questioning authority, can create conditions ripe for abuse. Reform efforts have included calls for better education about what constitutes appropriate medical treatment, the presence of chaperones during medical examinations, policies that require multiple adults to be present during certain interactions with minors, and mechanisms for athletes to report concerns without fear of retaliation or disbelief. For the hundreds of women and girls who were victimized by Nassar, the journey toward healing has been long and difficult, complicated by the public nature of the case, the re-traumatization that can occur when survivors are asked to repeatedly recount their abuse, and the ongoing litigation and institutional reforms that keep the case in the public eye years after Nassar was imprisoned. Many survivors have spoken about the importance of being believed, of having their experiences validated, and of seeing Nassar held accountable, but they have also emphasized that true justice would have meant preventing the abuse from occurring in the first place, and that the failures of the institutions that should have protected them represent a betrayal that is almost as painful as the abuse itself. The Larry Nassar case stands as one of the most significant sexual abuse scandals in modern American history, a case that exposed the willingness of powerful institutions to sacrifice the safety and well-being of children in service of their own interests, and that demonstrated the courage and resilience of survivors who refused to be silenced and who demanded accountability and change even when doing so required them to relive their trauma in public.